Uh, Before we actually get started and go deep into what we want to talk about on how we see predominantly majority of our customers doing Apple app development with EC2 Mac instances, I just wanted to touch upon, and I always like to touch upon a bit upon the history of EC2 Mac instances. So this story started sometime back in 2018, and that was around the time I was a product manager here within EC2. And we had this internal team within Amazon, which was responsible for app development for all of Apple devices. So think about like Amazon's retail app, which you probably were using during the Black Friday and the Cyber Monday holiday. We had Kindle, Alexa, Goodreads, all of those teams, and we had like tens of thousands of Apple developers within Amazon. They were submitting their builds in a central system, and this team was responsible for managing the Mac build infrastructure at that time, which unfortunately was just a physical lab in Seattle and a physical lab in San Diego, where we had racked and stacked the Mac minis. And this team was facing all the challenges with managing the physical Mac infrastructure, including the HVAC, the cooling. There were situations when, if there was an incident or a Mac would shut down, then somebody had to drive to the lab to power it back on. So all those challenges. And this team was basically trying to also give an on-demand cloud-like experience to their end users. So they came to us. They wanted to get some insights into how EC2 and AWS actually takes care of like the scaling of the APIs and so on. And we tried to dig deeper with them. We tried to understand what exactly are you trying to do? And then they told us that they want to give a cloud-like experience to the internal Amazon teams for Apple app development. And that was around the time when we actually started looking deep into it, which is, hey, we have tons and tons and thousands of enterprise customers who are building apps for Apple today. They might be facing the same problem. And once we started peeling the layers, we realized that this was a prevalent problem across all our customers who had migrated the majority of their CI/CD workloads to the cloud, but Mac development workloads were just an outlier, that they were still running on premises or in a colo location, or for Macs in a closet under the desk, trying to do just the Apple CI/CD. And the core reason was Apple app development, as all of you are aware, relies on tools like Xcode and Apple's proprietary software that can only legally and like EULA compliant way run on physical Mac hardware. And until that time, EC2 had a wide variety of instance and the server offerings, but we hadn't had a situation where we had taken a commercial off-the-shelf or walked into a retail store and bought a physical Mac or like a third-party server and just integrated it with EC2 to make it available as an instance. So a couple of serendipitous things happened at that time. One was we ended up, in 2017, we did an entire re-architecture of our virtualization stack called Nitro. And as a part of that initiative, what we did is a bunch of services that we used to run on the hypervisor, on the physical server, we moved them either to our control plane or dedicated offload cards called Nitro cards. And those Nitro cards were from this great Israeli startup that we ended up acquiring called Annapurna Labs. So one of the key, I would say, tenets for that Nitro re-architecture was that we want resources on the physical server to be available to the customer. We don't want to run our own services and take those resources away. So the hypervisor became extremely thin, extremely light, and its only responsibility was to carve out the physical server into smaller VMs and ensure that the security and the isolation boundaries are held intact. What we also learned at that time was, hey, if we remove the hypervisor, we can give a bare metal server to our customers while giving the same experience that our customers rely upon, be it the EC2 API, like the run instances API, or any of the other things like Amazon Machine Images or AMIs. That was 2017 when we ended up launching the VMware Cloud on AWS, which was literally the ESXi running directly on EC2 bare metal machines. So we had this customer challenge on one side. We also had the Nitro innovation. So we started thinking that can we take Nitro even a step further? And that was, we have our own off-the-shelf designed, our own designed servers today as EC2 instances. Can we take a physical Mac and integrate it with the Nitro system and make it available to customers as, just like any other EC2 instance? So you can still, on demand, spin up an instance. Once you're done with your build or whatever workload that you want to run, you can spin it down. And that way you don't have to go through the hassle of managing your own labs or your desk of physical Macs that you have to keep maintain. You need to maintain, you need to patch, you need to upgrade, all those other things. So around 2019, we started working on it. We worked closely with Apple at all leadership levels. And then just fast forward to 2020, when we ended up launching the EC2 Mac instance, which was the first time cloud provider was providing on-demand access to Mac. And that was the x86-based Mac instances, which was the last Mac x86 or the Intel Mac Mini that Apple actually launched, because at that time they ended up doing, announced, and they also launched their whole transition of the Mac lineup to Apple Silicon. So that is where the journey started, and it's been to the date, I think, literally to the date, 3 years since we launched EC2 Mac instances. And just talking about some of the key benefits of EC2 Mac instances. So like I talked about, it's the elasticity. If you need physical Macs, you don't need to, access to macOS environments, you can just log into your EC2 console and you can get access to macOS, whether it is Monterey, or it is Ventura, or it is Sonoma, or any macOS version, like literally within minutes. When we launched EC2 Mac, it took us a long time, or the instance from the time you launched to the time it became SSH accessible. It used to take a lot of time for good reasons. Some of them were for how we designed the bare metal instances on our side. On Apple Silicon, we had a challenge of how Apple changed the ownership or the boot security policy, but we worked closely with them. And today, when you spin up an EC2 Mac instance, whether it is Apple Silicon or x86, within 5 minutes, your instance should be SSHable, ready to start your build job. Then another thing which we learned talking to the customers that the customers really loved was the concept of Amazon Machine Images, or AMIs. Imaging macOS or re-imaging macOS on a physical Mac hasn't always been easy. There are a lot of services and third-party solutions that do try to provide that service. But if you have a physical Mac, say, for example, running specific macOS version for Monterey or Ventura, then re-imaging that to run, say, for example, Sonoma can take time and can take effort, and sometimes it is not feasible depending on your setup. On EC2 Mac, one of the key tenets that we adopted was we want to give the same experience as we have today for any other EC2 Linux or Windows platform. So what we did was we brought this concept of Amazon Machine Images, or AMIs. Even if you use Linux or Windows instances, you're pretty familiar with it. We tried to make it work with the EC2 Mac instances. And the way we do it is every AMI with which you launch an EC2 Mac instance, it gets presented to the physical Mac as an external NVMe device. So it's basically Thunderbolt over NVMe that we actually implement. So from a Mac perspective, it's almost like you took an external SSD that had the image, that had the tooling, that had the specific Xcode version that you want to run. You put it in the external port at the back of the Mac, press the power button, and you started the entire boot process. And similarly, one of the benefits that we get from the integration with AWS Nitro is we have a separate network and the storage bandwidth on EC2 Mac instances that are enabled by the Nitro card that is part of the whole Nitro system. So we do not rely upon the external LAN port or the Mac specifications when it comes to giving you the network and the storage bandwidth. And both of them are dedicated and separate. And it does turn to be useful if, say, for example, you are pulling a lot of data over the network, but at the same time, the application that you're running in your EC2 Mac environment is writing intensively to the EBS volume. And then, as with AWS, just by the virtue of how we design our data centers, the concept of availability zones and regions, you can actually set up your entire CI/CD pipeline for high availability and resiliency. And the last thing that did take us a few iterations, but we got it right before we launched, was the virtual private cloud on EC2 Mac instances is exactly the same virtual private cloud that you get on any other EC2 instance. So any capability and features, say, for example, if it is the subnets or it is the security groups, the firewall rules, what you as a customer have set it up today to run any of your EC2 workloads, you can run your EC2 Mac instances within the same VPC, and you don't have to ask yourself the question whether this specific VPC feature or this specific security configuration, would it work with EC2 Mac or not? In almost all of the cases, it will work exactly as you expect it to. So here it does talk about, on this slide, we talk about the different capabilities that AWS brings to the table with EC2 Mac instances. More than the elasticity, in addition to the elasticity, reliability, and the security that we talked about, EC2 Mac instances, just like any other EC2 instance, they come with a plethora of AWS services integrated. And what I mean there is, what we see talking to a lot of our customers in an on-premise environment is they will have different tools, different vendors for the different part of their architecture and security. And here within AWS, you can just use any of our purpose-built services to be able to get the same benefit. So just as an example, if you want to, say, for example, manage the inventory, you can use AWS Systems Manager, which can take care of the configuration and the compliance and so on. If, say, for example, you want to monitor your CPU or memory and be able to elastically scale your fleet up and down, you can rely on Amazon CloudWatch, and you can create an auto-scaling group with which you will be able to scale your EC2 Mac fleet up or down based on what volume of build jobs you're getting. So say, for example, if most of the build jobs or the developers actually submit their builds during the weekdays, then you can elastically scale up your fleet during the weekday, and you can scale it down during the weekend when you don't have a lot of jobs or the build jobs getting submitted by your developers. And this leads to operational efficiency, this leads to cost savings, and it tends to, over the longer period, return a better ROI than physically installing the fleet. Similarly, like I mentioned, you don't need to manage a disparate fleet for different macOS versions. Switching between macOS versions is as easy as just terminating an instance and launching a new Mac instance. And then since launch, we have added a bunch of features, especially in-place software upgrades. If you want to move to a later macOS version that we haven't yet published the ARMY for, you can do that with an in-place upgrade. And you can also leverage any of the beta macOS versions as long as you're enrolled in the seed or the test program for Apple. Within your macOS environment, you can actually move to a beta or a macOS version. Say, for example, you want your application to be supported on day 0 when Apple releases the general master. And you can actually, if you want, you can actually create your own customized image or an AMI for that beta macOS version that you can use to potentially launch, say, for example, dozens or hundreds of instances. And lastly, like I mentioned, VPC and CloudTrail, as well as CloudFormation and different compliance that Amazon EC2 already offers, EC2 Mac just ends up inheriting it, and that makes, say, for example, talking to your regulators or your internal security IT teams much easier. So moving on and touching upon Apple Silicon Mac instances. So it was It did take us some time to launch our first EC2 Mac Apple Silicon instance, or the EC2 Mac M1 instances that we launched last year, because as a part of the transition from x86 or Intel to Apple Silicon, Apple did make a bunch of changes to the security or the boot orchestration workflow and so on. And we had to work closely with them to make it more amenable in a cloud-like environment. So last year when we launched Apple EC2 Mac or EC2 M1 Mac instances, which was the first Apple Silicon Mac, the performance numbers that the customers reported were awesome. Like, you could get up to 60% price performance improvement compared to x86 EC2 Mac instances. And a lot of customers at that time were working on transitioning their apps from running on Rosetta to native Apple Silicon. And EC2 Apple Silicon Mac instance, or the M1 Mac instance, really helped them with that transition. And like I said, it's just the same Nitro system that is under the hood. So except for the Mac changing, everything else stayed the same. There were very little compromises. And for a lot of times, our customers reported that transitioning from x86 to Apple Silicon was as easy as basically just migrating from one instance family to the other one. So, like I mentioned, our first iteration of the M1 Mac instance did take us a long time because we had to work with some really low-level changes that Apple had implemented, and we had to wait for those fixes or those changes to come in before we can provide it in a cloud-native environment. But the more important part was, once we actually got past those initial hurdles, one of the key tenets we have had is Apple is doing incredible stuff in Apple Silicon. Like, from one generation to the other, we are seeing improvements across the board, be it the CPU or the memory or the GPU performance and so on. So one of the key tenets we have is we want to bring those Apple's innovations and get them into your hands as soon as possible. And the building blocks that are enabled by the Nitro system allow us to do just that. So this year, in Q1, Apple actually launched both the M2 and the M2 Pro-based Mac Mini. And in the third quarter, just months after Apple's release, we were able to get these M2 and the M2 Pro-based EC2 Mac instances in the hands of our customers. Both M2 and the M2 Pro are generally available today. And along with M1, they offer one of the broadest choice of Apple Silicon Macs in the cloud environment that you would find anywhere. So depending on how much CPU or how much RAM your workload requires, or say, for example, there are specific GPU requirements that you have to be able to run graphics-intensive tests, all of those are available today on EC2 in the form of different EC2 Mac instance families. So just going through this list, these are the different API names that you will see on your console if you want to spin up a specific Apple Silicon-based Mac instance. And I should just call out that these EC2 Mac instances, even though they support the same API, are bare metal Mac instances. So, which means that compared to, say, for example, if you want to virtualize, the Mac, you can do it just like you would do on a physical Mac. But in an EC2 environment, these physical Macs, or like the Mac OS, directly boots on the underlying Mac hardware. Like, one of the tenets we have identified is that a Mac sitting in an AWS data center shouldn't necessarily know or be able to differentiate between whether it is sitting in a data center or sitting on a desk. And as a corollary to that tenet is, we make no modifications to either the physical Mac or to Mac OS apart from installing a certain libraries or the tooling that makes it within the Mac OS AMI that we officially released to make it work. The Mac is unmodified completely, with a small caveat of, like, we do disable the Wi-Fi and the Bluetooth on the physical Mac for security, and we do turn off the speakers and the microphone because We don't want somebody to be playing music in our data center on a physical Mac, but other than that, the Mac is completely unmodified, and it is one of those tenets that we want to continue following going forward, so that and whenever we have a new Mac that we want to offer as an EC2 instance, we have least amount of regression going forward. And this is just talking about the incredible pace that the AWS Nitro system provides and the capability that allows us to bring EC2 Mac into your hands after an Apple's release as fast as possible. Like the Nitro provides us the fundamental building Lego blocks that we can rearrange every time we have a new Mac, so that the pace of innovation, we are either able to match or exceed when it comes to following Apple's Apple Silicon, new Apple Silicon Macs that Apple keeps on pushing forward and launching and pushing the envelope. So, like I said, 3 years ago, this journey started. Since then, we have had thousands of customers adopt EC2 Mac to run their most critical workloads. And they have seen tremendous performance improvements, both on either the build performance or the build failures or the number of parallel jobs they have been able to run. So to be able to talk more about partnerships and integrations, I would like to invite Dave to the stage.
Thank you so much, Manish. And yeah, as Manish mentioned, this is a product that has been just spearheaded and developed really for customers working on their own individual builds. Personally, I started at AWS just a bit over a year ago. So I would say I was here when a lot of the development on EC2 Mac itself was going incredibly, and working with our team, being able to do what I do as a specialist solutions architect and understand what our customers are doing, present that to the team. Just that partnership alone has been immensely useful in making sure that folks are making the most of what they have. But it's definitely not just one. We have many customers that have been taking advantage of EC2 Mac. And these customers are absolutely seeing, as Manish mentioned earlier, those performance improvements. The build failures are going down and build speeds going up, having that option of flexible storage, and of course, being able to flip versions of macOS as needed. And of course, I definitely don't want to neglect the partners. And of course, we do have a certain customer in the upper left there that we'll be hearing a bit more from. On our partner side, though, I don't want to neglect that. There are some important things, especially around virtualization. Vir2 Anka is a solution that allows for type 2 virtualization. Within the type 2 virtualization within EC2 Mac itself. So you're able to not only take that as take that virtual machine, create that, it can be orchestrated, this can be mass configured, and it can actually integrate with even further if you have more of an Anka infrastructure on site. HP Anywhere has a product formerly known as Teradici. If you've seen this, this allows for, if you've ever connected to a computer via VNC, you'll know that there's usually a little bit of lag, there's a little bit of compression that's missing there. HP Anywhere has what's called the PC over IP protocol, and that allows for highly compressed and highly secured virtualization. No worries.
Check 1 2. Check 1 2. Check. Yeah.
No worries at all. Thank you so much. And with HP Anywhere, this will allow not only connectivity to the GUI for your own viewing, but for real-time testing as well. A lot of our customers find that in addition to doing traditional app development and app builds, that the requirement of understanding what's happening visually and being able to verify that, check against other things, has just been immensely useful. And one of the most significant partners as well that I definitely don't want to miss here, and we're going to get into just a bit more, is Jamf. Jamf is the leading Mac and iOS management platform. They've been doing things for quite a while when it comes to managing Macs in enterprise. A lot of folks, I'm personally a certified expert and have a very, very long history with mobile device management in general. So our partnership with Jamf started in 2021, and we offered agent-based enrollment, which allowed you to get inventory, have an idea of what cloud computers that you have, cloud Macs that you have, and run scripts on those. And today in 2023, we did release a script for full MDM enrollment automation. So this will allow you to have additional commands, abilities for your admins, your architects, and uses the Jamf API itself for profile creation. We're going to take a look at how that works exactly in just a moment. But most importantly, this is allowing you for the compliance, consistency, and really ensuring that your entire Apple fleet is visible and up to date to the folks that matter most. One thing I did want to mention also, this being a management framework, a lot of folks have IT teams and they want to understand where their users may be going wrong. Being able to recreate a user scenario and actually step through that on a Mac that's enrolled can be a definite advantage for folks that are working in that manner. So let's take a look at MDM enrollment. This is a script that I'd written in partnership with Jamf and AWS. There's a lot of folks to thank, so this absolutely was not a solo effort in most of this. But the Apple script itself, I program in odd languages. That's my odd language, and that's mine. So let's take a look at how this is working. And we're going to start with an Amazon EC2 Mac instance, which, of course, is on a dedicated host. This is running on actual Apple hardware, as we'd seen in the beginning. When this instance launched, we did a little bit of preparation here. This is all on the GitHub repo that we're going to have at the end of this. There is a script that runs, and this script, being resident, also has a few rights, specifically an IAM instance profile. This is allowing this script to go out and say, I need to get some very secret credentials that can be rolled, that can be rotated as needed. And these are stored in, by default, AWS Secrets Manager. So this is highly encrypted and ensuring that the information itself is not available to anything that doesn't need it. So we have that access being given this, and the secret is going back to the script itself. When those are retrieved, and that is at runtime, the instance actually reaches next with credentials over the VPC to the Jamf Pro server itself. And from the Jamf Pro server, it is going to receive back for the enrollment and invitation code. The script itself is going to use that invitation code and create an enrollment profile. Once this profile is created, it is applied to the EC2 Mac instance, and from there, we basically have our enrollment. And this is it in action. There was basically not a hand on the screen until the very end. You can actually see a disconnection that's going to happen in just a moment on within this video. So this is very, very short, but what you're seeing is not something you'd normally see. This is actually a process of enrollment that can happen in the background before an instance is even connected to by an end user. So we've really found that MDM enrollment was something intrinsic to really a part of our customers' macOS security and deployment policies. So automating this process was just a really important one. And with that, I really would like to hand things over to Stephen Voorhees from Dropbox, who's going to give us a little bit more information on how they've used EC2 Mac and all we have to offer.
Thank you, Manish and Dave. I appreciate it. So I am Steve Voorhees, and I lead the platform team at Dropbox. Yes, that's me, several years younger, but that is me. So I'm really excited to be here today, because as you saw from what Manish and Dave showed, is there's AWS is really providing some really powerful capabilities to really turbocharge Apple app development. And what I'm going to cover today is really how Dropbox has been able to harness that and leverage that to really improve the efficiency of our Mac development as well as the productivity of our developers. But before that, I'm going to talk a little bit and give you a little bit of context and talk a little bit about Dropbox, our platform team, and how we've actually historically leveraged AWS for our development environments. All right, so I'm sure a lot of you have already heard of Dropbox. But the way we think about Dropbox is it really is a place where all of your team's content comes together. We have over 700 million registered users across 180 countries, and they really use Dropbox to really cut through the clutter of their workday and surface what matters most and enable them to focus more. And we do that through our products, right? I mean, all of you probably know our Dropbox file sync and share product. We have that plus the workflow capabilities we built around that, things like e-signature, PDF editing, video collaboration. And then we also have our new products. So Dropbox Dash is a universal search engine which goes beyond files and leverages AI to enable you to find, organize, and really get more out of your cloud content. And ultimately, all these tools work together to really make your teams more productive. All right, and kind of powering these products is our kind of global hybrid infrastructure. Okay, so our infrastructure is one where we run what we consider our core competencies in our own self-hosted infrastructure. These are things like storage, where we can gain economies of scale. But then we run our other workloads, which can in AWS, which can really gain from the benefits of the cloud. Where you have more flexibility, you have the ability to move fast and innovate. So my platform team is responsible for that hybrid infrastructure, and really and for the technical foundation for Dropbox. Our focus really is on improving the productivity of Dropbox developers. And we achieve this by providing, capabilities in the form of APIs, components, and tooling to really, across the developer lifecycle to really, improve, really optimize how our developers work. And the area of platform that's really most relevant for the conversation today is really our developer productivity area. This is the team that is leveraging AWS and really providing the tools to our developers across the development lifecycle to build, review, validate, and release software. So we've actually for years leveraged AWS for our development environments. AWS is really good for providing this because of the scalability, right, and the elasticity. It allows us to kind of, meet the demands of our infrastructure. So, basically, if we have more needs for workloads in our CI environment, or we need to fluctuate based on headcount needs, we're able to leverage AWS to provide those developer environments. And the way we do this is we actually provide each of our engineers with a pre-configured, Linux instance running in AWS. And this is generally, and these are we call them dev boxes. And these are generally used for server development as well as web development. And what these dev boxes do is they provide isolation from each other, but then they also allow us to really choose the most suitable instance type for the workload of the engineer. For example, we actually recently enabled GPU instances for our dev boxes to support some of our AI capability development that we're currently doing. So more recently, our DevBox strategy actually increased to actually include desktop development. And it actually started with Windows, right? Because not a lot of our developers are running Windows, and so we needed a way to virtualize and enable them to test on Windows. But even more recently, we actually expanded that to Mac OS, and that's really the topic of today's discussion. So I'm going to be sharing kind of the journey that we had in really harnessing the potential of the EC2 Mac. All right. So let's start by kind of talking about what are our use cases. And I don't think they're going to be tremendously surprising. I mean, for all the kind of products that we deliver on the Mac platform, there's various tasks that we have to enable for our developers. First, they need to be able to build their software, right? They need to be able to sign the binary and get it ready for release. We need to be able to run a series of tests on various Mac OS platforms, and obviously we need to be able to debug as well. And we actually have similar needs for mobile and iOS as well. And one of the key things for us for this is really having virtualization. This really provides us the necessary separation and flexibility for our workloads. For example, we actually have the need to run our dev boxes or our virtual machines for macOS both locally on the developer's laptop as well as in the cloud for CI. Locally on the desktop to enable our engineers to be able to debug when problems happen, and in the cloud in our CI environment where we need to do automations for building and testing, right? And the CI, this CI environment really is fundamental to our day-to-day, to the day-to-day lives of our Dropbox engineers, right? Because every single commit that an engineer makes actually goes through a series of validation across multiple macOS versions. So you can imagine a single change can actually trigger dozens of builds, which actually run testing and validation across everywhere from macOS 10.13 to the most recent beta version, macOS, and with the most recent being macOS 14. And so this actually ends up resulting in upwards around 3,500 builds a day on Mac at Dropbox. So obviously virtualization is really important for us, and having the ability to scale and be flexible to our workloads is critical. And so I'm going to dive into a little bit of our journey, in leveraging EC2 Mac. All right, so I love this picture. This was our old setup. This is actually, if you look at it, it's got the circles. I don't know if you remember the, I think it was 2013 Mac Pros that were cylinders. We racked those things up, and they served us well for many years. But then in 2022, a few things happened. First, Mac OS 13 actually deprecated support for this hardware. Okay, that's a problem. And then at the same time, VMware actually discontinued ESX support for Mac hardware, and VMware was what we used at the time for virtualization. And this was at a time, it was like the spring or summer of 2022 when we were about to begin that march towards the release of Mac OS 13, and we needed to do testing. We needed to make sure it worked. So we actually, we were a little bit panicked, and we had to really scramble to find a workable solution for Mac OS 13 testing. And so we moved quickly, and we did what any logical team would do. We went to the Apple Store. We bought a crate of Mac Minis, and we shipped them up to Portland, where our data center is, and we racked them up, and we started using them. Needless to say, this was not the most sustainable solution in the world, but it served us relatively well while we figured out what a good, sustainable, and long-term solution is going to be. All right. And so to address it permanently, we actually very quickly identified EC2 Mac for its scale as well as its flexibility. And we paired it with Parallels, which is an off-the-shelf virtualization solution, which actually is adaptable to both local machine laptops as well as the cloud. And by implementing some automation around those things, we were actually able to very seamlessly migrate our workloads from this kind of old setup here to AWS EC2 Mac, and able to actually run workloads both within our CI environment in the cloud as well as on our developer laptops. And this transition really offered significant flexibility compared to this previous setup, and really ensured seamless operations for us and support for changing workloads over time. All right. So kind of summing up our experience with EC2 Mac. I think first and foremost, AWS, the scalable infrastructure and intuitive API really kind of freed us from having to really understand the intricacies of the Mac OS. Right? We have a world-class data center operations team, but it's not really our core competency or their core competency to understand how to rack Macs, how to configure Macs, how to do all these things that you had to do that Manish was talking about. And so it freed us from that and allowed us to focus on other things and on our core competencies, while AWS handled the kind of flexibility and infrastructure for us on the Mac side. Second, we're able to leverage the multiple different processor architectures that EC2 Mac has to offer, really helping us kind of cater to the evolving workloads that we have at Dropbox. For example, next we actually are able to really leverage, it positioned us well for the future because we're able to very quickly evaluate new instance types. For example, we very recently tested out the M2 and the M2 Pro instance types. We were able to do it super quickly and really without any obligation or lead time. And finally, we were actually able to replace a pretty critical piece of infrastructure, without really very easily, as well as without incurring any upfront costs. For those of you who know about data centers, there's CapEx involved in getting these machines, right? And so we were able to avoid upfront CapEx, which was very useful for us. And it was particularly important in replacing this existing infrastructure, which had reached end of life. Okay, and so as you can see, kind of our virtualization solution that leverages both AWS, EC2 Mac, and Parallels really provided us agility, cost effectiveness, as well as scalability, and it ultimately empowered us to navigate hardware transitions very, very seamlessly. All right, and with that, I'm actually going to invite Dave and Manish back on stage to close us out.
Stephen, thank you so much. Thank you so much. This was a great insight into how Dropbox really was got to use EC2 Mac and found some really awesome ways. One thing I did want to mention before we close out, this is maybe an early EC2 Mac session, but we do have a few others. So I did want to make sure that any folks that are at reInvent right now and looking towards our other sessions, definitely check these out if you're able to. And one more thing on just a few resources here from what we were speaking about earlier, getting started with EC2 Mac. We have a GitHub repository for that and MDM enrollment just below that. Replace root volume for quicker instance cycling times and the ability to use AMIs in ways that you couldn't before. Building EC2 Macs with Packer. To actually build those AMIs in an automated fashion, and working with auto-scaling, and we mentioned Anka for virtualization too.